You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody, and on this installment of the 7 Days of Christmas, we've got Scott Hartwig. Scott, as you probably know, if you listened all the way back to the beginning of the free feed, wrote a book about basically the difference between the killer angels and reality and history, and we talked about that. It's our second most popular, most downloaded episode, and it's also our second oldest episode that has been released. It was the second episode to be released, I guess is what I'm saying. And so it's like right behind the first narrative episode as far as number of downloads. And the two of those episodes are just always up at the top, more than any of the other episodes as far as downloads go. Scott wrote an article for the National Park Service website back in, I think it was 2011, and it is called A Mystery Solved? ? And he's talking about the Harvest of Death photos that no one seems to know the location of, and he thought that he had a pretty good idea of where it might be. Now, over here at Addressing Gettysburg, we seem to all kind of concur with him. Like he lays out some pretty good evidence. I know there's people out there who don't think he's right. I know Tim has done a debunking video, and so it's always up for debate. Everything's always up for debate, but it is a very interesting thing to ponder nonetheless. And so we had Scott come on to talk about his theories and why he thinks what he thinks. And listen, if you've ever listened to Scott talk, it's just great to listen to Scott talk. Everybody loves listening to Scott Hartwig. The guy knows a lot. He's a really cool guy, really nice to talk to, a lot of fun. I always enjoy it, and I love having him on. And I think you're going to like listening to this too. I'm assuming that because, like I said, he has the second most downloaded episode in our catalog. So the guy's obviously pretty popular. So this is from our Patreon feed as well. Hope you consider joining us over there. And happy holidays. All right. So the article is A Mystery Solved. There's 3 parts. It's on the Gettysburg National Military Park blog. You wrote it in 2011, but it, let's see, looks like it's kind of been, until that point, a lifetime search for you at that point. What got you interested in these photographs, and particularly the ones that you're talking about in the article here?
It was the fact that we didn't know who they were, and we didn't know where it was.
Okay.
And I was always interested in not being. I did not care to be the guy who found where the picture was taken. That, in some ways, wasn't that important to me.
Okay.
What was more important to me was who were these people, where was this, and let's give some identity.
So it was find the place so we can name the guy, or not name, but identify the guy.
Or identify who they probably are.
Right, okay.
That was what I was most interested in because, for most of my professional life, I mean, they were just props on a stage, and they were real people.
Right.
And they got killed in the Battle of Gettysburg, and they're buried on the field, and we don't even know who they are. And, the photographer, Gardner, and the others who were with him, whether they documented where they were, they kept a journal or diary or something like that. I would imagine that they probably did. It doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing written that they wrote down that said, here's where we were at this time, and these are the people that we photographed. And I think they were in a hurry, for one thing. And they were interested, Gardner was particularly interested in photographing the dead. Which is, it becomes interesting when you think about, okay, if these photographs were taken on the first day's battlefield, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me that Gardner and his guys would load up their wagon and they would drive down the Chambersburg Pike, past the Lutheran Seminary, which is crowded with wounded from the battle, and not even pause to take any pictures there. They just keep on going into town and then ride south of town and start taking pictures down around the wheat field and Rose Hill and the Trossel Farm and everything like that. And I'm like, it doesn't make sense if they were coming to photograph important places on the battlefield,
right,
which at that point, I'm not sure anybody would have been interested in spending the time because everybody was pretty busy.
Sure.
You're either preparing to move if you're in the Army, or you've got a job, a really unpleasant job of burying the dead on the battlefield, or you're busy dealing with the wounded, and a photographer
is a nuisance.
Yes, and also if what you're interested in is the dead, then you have to go where the dead are.
Right.
And they had already buried a fair number of the dead on the field by the time he gets here on July the 5th. So I think it's possible, we don't know this. I mean, it's possible if he goes out on the first day's field, he photographs Union dead, because that would be almost the only place he could have found any Union dead by July the 5th.
Sure, because the Union was south of town for 2 days. So the first guys are going to bury are the ones that they can see right in front of them, right?
Right, and they're also going to bury their dead who are behind their lines or within their lines.
Sure.
So they're going to bury their own dead, like the dead from Pickett's charge and some of the second day's fighting. But the other thing is that for the dead who are on Sickles' line,
okay,
which is the Emmitsburg Road leading back towards Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top, the 5th Corps on July the 5th had advanced out to the Emmitsburg Road. And they had bivouacked on the Emmitsburg Road, and they had built breastworks from the fence rails along the Emmitsburg Road. And then on the morning of the 5th, or actually they did that on the night of the 4th, on the morning of the 5th, the Corps began to move. They sent details from the road eastwards to begin to bury the dead. So by the time Gardner gets there, it's probably not till the afternoon when he gets down, because Fresnito has that he probably took a lot of those images on Rose Hill, the most famous images, the Confederate dead on July the 5th. By the time he gets down there, the Union dead are largely buried. But I also think you only want so many images of Union dead.
Right,
Gardner.
right.
You're more interested in images now of Confederate dead. And I think there's a reason why he's not pausing in the fields near the Emmitsburg Road to photograph Confederate dead, because there were plenty of Confederate soldiers who got killed out in that area on the 2nd and the 3rd day, is because they've been buried already. But the area that they haven't reached and haven't started to bury yet is that area down towards the wheat field and Rose Hill. So I think that's why he ends up going down there. And no doubt he probably had some contacts in the Army, I'm sure, and some of these people were probably telling him where he should go if that's what he's looking for to take photographs of.
Right.
Let me back up here.
Okay,
This is Bob, by the way. Just to provide for the listener some background.
Yeah, I was just going to get to that. Yeah, go ahead.
We're talking about, first, the name Fresnito was mentioned. This is William Fresnito, who wrote a book back in the 1970s, I think, called Gettysburg, A Journey in Time. And a great book where he takes a modern view of many of the most famous photographs from Gettysburg, and a modern in the 1970s, and compares it and shows you in the book the same view of the dead or whatever it was he was taking a picture of. You're mentioning this man Gardner, Alexander Gardner, who's coming up. For those of you who don't know, there's that famous photograph reproduced at the Wayside exhibit at Devil's Den of the quote sharpshooter question mark on the Wayside. That was an Alexander Gardner photograph. That's the one that some people think there's a ghost story about because the ghost of the man. I don't buy all this stuff. But this was pretty clear case, according to Fresnito, that it was a body that was moved about 40 yards. So just trying to get the listener to understand the area we're talking about. That Devil's Den was the left end of General Sickles' 3rd Corps. And if you head west from there, the first big road you come to is the Emmitsburg Road. Gardner is advancing up from the southwest on the Emmitsburg Road. And it had always been my understanding, of course, that was informed by Fresnito, that then they will leave the Emmitsburg Road and begin to work their way east to take these photographs. having said that, in Frazanito's excellent book, he does say, and these photographs that we're talking about are at the end of this book, he does admit that he has never found where these pictures were taken, or where the exact camera was.
Right.
And I don't know if that's what first alerted you to start looking or not, but I'm really impressed if you already knew ahead of time that wasn't that no one knew that. I wouldn't have known that.
Well, what I'd say is Frazanito's book was a groundbreaking book. I mean, his book on Gettysburg and Antietam, and then he did one on the Overland Campaign. I mean, they were all groundbreaking books because they made history come alive for people. Because you could go out there on the battlefield with this historic image, and he was an intelligence officer in Vietnam, and he brought that skill of being an intelligence officer to his application of trying to figure out where these photos were taken. And there's one photograph of Confederate dead down on Rose Hill, which is near the wheat field on the second day's battlefield, that for many, many, many years was always identified as dead of the 24th Michigan near what's called McPherson's Woods, but was actually owned by a farmer named John Herbst Woods. And Frazanito conclusively established that photograph was of Confederate dead and where it was taken, because he was able to identify the exact location. So, I mean, the work that Frazanito did was really remarkable stuff. But I would say definitely his book interested me in these photos. And then when I started working at Gettysburg National Military Park in 1979, of course, people I was working with, we talked about the photos all the time. And there was always in the back of my mind an interest in, boy, I would love to know where those photos were taken. So to kind of back up and for the listener to see how I arrived at where I think this whole thing happened, the history of it is that I get to Gettysburg in 1979, work as a seasonal, get hired eventually as a permanent, and eventually I became the supervisory historian at the park there. And throughout the years, we were super busy all the time. I had a lot of stuff to do, so I wasn't like running around the field trying to find where these photos were taken. But sometimes at lunchtime or whatever, if I have some time, I go out there with the pictures and I would walk around. And I was convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that these photographs were taken somewhere on the Third Corps line.
The Trossel Farm.
Trossel Farm, probably. They had to be. That was my feeling. It just had to be.
Right.
And the unit that kind of fit what you were seeing in the images was 120th New York, which was positioned near the Trossel Farm, had to make a change of front because they got flanked by the Confederates of Longstreet's corps who were attacking, and they took really heavy losses in this fight. And every time I would go out there, I could always get one of the views to line up with the landscape, but the other never would. And you're saying the reverse of the first view. Like you could get one to line up, but then because the two pictures are basically the camera turns around, moves a little bit, like 135 degrees. Yeah.
Okay.
So when you would make that 135 degree turn, you couldn't match the landscape.
Right.
You just couldn't do it. And I thought, well, maybe there's some trees there that weren't there. Maybe there's this. Maybe there's that. And then over the years, once we started doing the landscape clearing on the battlefield, I thought, okay, this is going to open up the view. Now I'm going to find the view.
Yeah.
And it didn't. It still didn't. And meanwhile, while I was trying to find this place in the south end of the battlefield, I had other people who were coming to me and presenting their theories to me about where the image was taken. It was taken near the Spangler Farm, where Pickett's division formed, because these guys were skirmishers of the 5th New Jersey. It was taken out where Berdan sharpshooters had a skirmish with the Confederates on July 2nd on Seminary Ridge. It was taken
Willard's
Brigade. It was taken on the skirmish line east of Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. And the thing about all of these that would always happen is that people would not pay any attention to the evidence in the photographs. What they were looking for was the landscape. That's what they looked for. And as I'll get to, the evidence in the photograph is crucial to locating where these pictures are taken, because you're wasting your time if you're looking east of Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, or if you're looking at East Cavalry Battlefield, or if you're looking at near the Spangler Farm, or where the sharpshooters had their skirmish, you're just wasting your time. The reason you're wasting your time is in the image, that is a line of battle that you're looking at, all those dead men in that photograph. That's not a skirmish line.
Right.
If that was a skirmish line, every skirmisher would have been
dead.
killed.
Yeah.
That never happened in the battle. We know that. That's not a theory. That's a fact. We know that. So that's a battle line laying there. Now, the second thing you see in the photograph is that all their equipment's taken off and their shoes are taken off.
Okay.
And you don't see any Confederate dead in the photograph either. So now that starts to narrow where this picture could be taken. It had to have been taken somewhere where these bodies were either in no man's land or behind Confederate lines. Because the Union Army is not going to take their shoes and equipment off and leave them lying there like that. That's not going to happen. If they can get access to their dead, that isn't going to happen. That's why I thought, okay, it's got to be on Sickles' line. And I didn't consider the first day's field. But the evidence in the photograph is telling you it's got to be in one of these places.
Let me just interject.
Yeah.
Gardner himself will give some written clues about these. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah.
Yes, he will. Gardner, in his sketchbook, which he published, I think, at the end of the war, right after the war, he identified in that one of the photographs as on the right wing where General Reynolds fell.
Right.
Which has always confused people because General Reynolds commanded the left wing of the Army, not the right wing. And it's possible Gardner just got that wrong. He knew it was some wing. Thought maybe it was the right wing. He didn't know. But the fact that he said it was where General Reynolds fell, I thought that's possible. But I always bought Frazanito's argument, which was he was competing with other people out there, Brady and the others, who had kind of scooped him with some of these. So he was trying to heighten the importance of this image, and he added where General Reynolds fell. However, in the 1880s, when Century Magazine began to publish what they called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, which was all these reminiscences by mainly high-ranking officers, generals, but sometimes from privates and sergeants and corporals and lieutenants. And they eventually compiled all these articles into a 4-volume set called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. If you look at volume 3 in that, when they have a sketch of the Gardner photograph, and they say in the sketch that this was located west of the seminary, where this photograph was taken.
Well, because he said that it's where General Reynolds fell.
He said where General Reynolds fell, but they didn't say in this where General Reynolds fell. They said this is west of the seminary, this photograph. I always found that interesting when I saw that, because I thought maybe somebody in Century Magazine, because they had to do some sort of research, you would think,
right,
in this, talked to somebody who knew where the image was taken. We don't know that. That's pure speculation. But I found it interesting that they did say that. So,
but couldn't they have been just deducing, because he said
they could have been
where General Reynolds fell, and they go, oh, well, he fell west of the seminary.
They could have been.
Yeah,
that's possible.
Okay.
So that is just a little piece of the puzzle, you might say there, right? So there's that part of it. But so I went all these years thinking it's got to be on the south end of the battlefield. That's got to be where it is. And it wasn't until we did the landscape clearing. And there was another thing I forgot to mention. There was years before, one of the historians who worked at the park, Kathy Harrison, we had been talking about this. She and a couple other people and myself, we were talking about it. And I remember her saying, I never forgot this, she said, we got to consider the possibility this photograph was taken on the first day's battlefield.
Okay.
But I'd been out there and I'd looked around. I'm like, it wasn't taken out here. There's nowhere that fits the evidence you see in the photograph. And there's nowhere in the 11th Corps line, for example, that you can match the terrain.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
so it's not until they take down a tree screen when we were doing our landscape clearing, the National Park Service had this policy, which was not a good one, but it was their policy, which was to plant tree screens where there were undesirable things in the way of the historic view.
Meaning modern
Yes.
structures, like
So,
hotels.
Along Seminary Ridge, on the kind of northern end of Seminary Ridge near the railroad cut, there was a hotel, Larson's Hotel. And they didn't want people seeing the hotel when they were looking back towards Seminary Ridge because they felt it marred the view. So they planted a tree screen. Now, of course, what the tree screen did is it completely blocked the view of a really important artillery position, Battery B, 4th U.S., which was located there and did a tremendous amount of damage to the Confederates attacking Seminary Ridge.
Is that Stewart's battery?
Stewart's Battery.
Okay.
Yeah. So you couldn't see that. And when that tree screen was in place, you could go out there all you wanted with those photographs and try to match them up, and you're never going to do it.
Okay.
Because it doesn't, when you turn and you look towards the northeast in the one photograph,
Towards Lee's headquarters.
it didn't look anything like it does in the photograph.
Because of the trees.
So when, I don't remember what day it was, and one day at lunchtime I drove out there and I had the photographs, and we'd done some tree clearing out there, and I started looking at the photographs and I was like, oh, okay.
We excited?
Yeah. I'm like, my feeling at that moment was I felt it in my bones.
All
I was
right.
like,
All right.
this is the spot. This is definitely the spot. So the terrain matched up. It was the only place I'd ever been at on the battlefield in over 30 years of wandering around the battlefield and looking for places this could have been. It was the only place.
Right.
And this is matching what you said earlier, because these are northern dead
Right.
without shoes.
Right.
This is 4 days after they had fallen, and they do look rather bloated in
Right.
in the photographs. And it's behind the Confederate lines, so they would
Right.
have taken the shoes, not buried the dead. So
Right.
all that's matching up. You're looking to the northeast. You're getting excited.
Right.
You're not in love yet until you turn and get the other angle, or
And then I turned to look at the other angle and I'm like, that's it. I mean, that's it. Now, also keeping in mind that those lenses in the 19th century distorted things
Right.
and sometimes made things look like they were much farther away.
I'm glad you brought this up because I was talking with Tim Smith today. And we were talking about photography and the difficulties in matching them up. And a couple of episodes ago, I had Dave Wilson on from Victorian Photography Studios in town, and he does tintypes and things like that. And one of the questions I asked him was, were the focal lengths the same as what we use today, like 35 millimeter or 50 millimeters? Like, no. There are all these weird things, by today's standards.
Right.
So, and I know from my experience as a photographer years ago that, you use different lenses for different things.
Right.
And they all distort the photograph differently, and they can make things that are very far apart look like they're very close together.
Right.
And so when you take a modern camera and you take a picture of an old, or, of a landscape, and you try to match it to an old photograph,
Right.
it probably usually works, but you could be also tricking yourself.
You could be.
Right.
Yes. And it's that's why, the tree screen was the critical component there in taking the tree screen out, because so you've got the landscape. The landscape to me matched perfectly.
Yeah.
Then on top of the landscape, now we have the evidence of the photograph. So as I look at the photograph, when you look at the one that the photographer was pointing the camera south. And today, if you were out on the battlefield, you would be looking south along Reynolds Avenue towards the Fairfield Road, Hagerstown Road, Route 116 West, the road with many names.
Right. The road we're on right now.
Right.
Yeah.
See, you would be looking in that direction.
Yeah.
And the number of dead that are in that photograph are consistent with the number of dead that the 121st Pennsylvania and the 20th New York State Militia suffered on July the 1st. The other thing I noticed in the photograph is it looks pretty clearly to me like the unit in the picture was flanked on the left, which is exactly what happened to the 121st.
Yeah.
There are no dead beyond that grouping. No one, and you can't really, you can't see perfectly, but I don't see any graves out beyond that grouping. And they clearly haven't started to bury those dead yet. They're working their way up towards them. The other thing about it is the 121st and the 20th New York State Militia, a large proportion of their dead who are in the National Cemetery are unidentified, which is also consistent with these men who are out here. It would have been very difficult to identify them. The few existing accounts that we have, there is in the 142nd Pennsylvania history, or maybe it's one of the battle wartime letters we have. I can't remember where the source was, but someone in the 142nd mentioned that there was a detail from their regiment that went out to bury the dead on the first day's battlefield. And we know that Charles Wainwright, the chief of artillery of the 1st Corps Artillery Brigade, he also rode out on the first day's field. And the description that these people provide of what the dead looked like and how difficult it was to identify is also consistent with what you see in this photograph.
Because they've been out there longest and just sitting in the sun.
Right. They've been out there a long time. The fellows, who are working out there are clearly, this is an unpleasant job. That it's got to the stench has got to be unbelievable. And they want to get this job done as quickly as they can, and they don't want to spend a lot of time with the photographer getting his pictures, which may be why I think he took 4 pictures out there, something like that.
Okay.
2 in one direction, 2 in the other direction, something like that.
So.
Go ahead. So anyway, what I found was the evidence of the photograph fit what happened in that location, and the landscapes matched up.
Mm-hmm.
I could not find any other place on the Gettysburg battlefield where the evidence and the landscape matches up. I can find places where part of the landscape matches up. I can find places where maybe some of the evidence might match up, but not both of them together.
Right. For you listeners, imagine taking a photograph of your home head on, like from the front of it. That's the first view. I'm not sure which one came first,
right? Yeah.
As far as Gardner take it, but then imagine you go around to the back corner of your house and take a view of your house again from 135 degrees away, but towards the back left corner of your house as you were originally facing it. So the original view is from the northeast, but now you're shooting more almost due south, I guess.
Yeah.
So now you're looking
kind of southwest.
So you're looking for in the original Gardner photograph, you're looking for things in the distance, like Seminary Ridge, or even further down, Pitzer's Woods, which is, I think that was Pitzer's Woods. I'm not sure, but that's no.
Wait, from where? Pitzer's from where?
The second view of the
second view. Photograph. You're looking at. Pitzer Woods would be much farther down. You're looking more south. Towards McMillan Woods, and north of McMillan Woods, and also there is a ridge west of. It's out in the direction of the FCC building. Now, I think it's on the other side of that.
Yeah,
that you can discern in the photograph today. There's more woods out there than there was in 1863. And that distorts your view a little bit
because they're taller.
Yeah,
but the thing is though, the there might be individual trees that are taller, or the trees all together are taller, but they're still sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of manipulated by the lay of the land,
right? And
the lay of the land kind of looks like it matches, especially with the so like the tree line in the background is going, for argument's sake, east-west, and then the ridge line that kind of goes into the photograph is going roughly north-south,
right?
And they look like they match,
right?
Okay,
but what about are there any? Have you heard from anybody? Like, has anybody said, that's bull? That's not what that is. Have you gotten any? I mean, I know this is an old article, but
no. Gary Edelman and Tim Smith did they did this video series about these photographs, and the whole series was kind of debunking everybody's. I don't want to call what I propose in this a theory. It's not a theory. It is a historical study That's what I did.
Okay.
I'm not theorizing about this stuff. The only place that you're theorizing is how did Gardner get there?
Okay, right? Because we don't know.
Okay, so that you got to theorize about. But
now, wait. On that note, did he come up alone, or did he? I thought I heard it somewhere that he hitched a ride with the sisters from Emmitsburg.
No, he had. I forgot whether the photographers were with him. I mean,
Timothy O'Sullivan. Was that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
he had some other people with him, and the guess is this is purely speculation and a guess is he's coming up from the south. Okay, if you're coming up along the Emmitsburg Road,
right. And when is he coming?
On July 5th.
July 5th. So what's going on the Emmitsburg Road?
If he is between Emmitsburg and Gettysburg. An army always has people who are well in advance of the main body. Mm-hmm. You always have vedettes and pickets and scouts and things like that. And from these, he could have learned that if you go up the Emmitsburg Road, there's a whole heap of soldiers there because the 5th Corps was along the Emmitsburg Road.
Mm-hmm.
So what he may have done, and again, this is just pure speculation, is he may have turned off on Bullfrog Road, made his way
that would be heading west off the Emmitsburg Road.
Right.
Heading west, and then he would have taken, just forgot the Black Horse Tavern Road,
yeah,
or one of those Willoughby Run Road, one of those roads up to the north to taking him to the Hagerstown Road. Turn right on Hagerstown Road. You're coming in towards Gettysburg, and as you're coming up towards Gettysburg, off to your left. What do you see? There are dead.
Brigade.
There's dead in the field, and there's burial details. Turn left, right across the fields, and there you are.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, it's speculation,
right.
But it's plausible speculation.
And it could be that that did happen, and he took a couple of shots and then moved on for one reason or another. Because when I was saying to Bob before you got here, when I was a photographer, and I'd like to do landscapes. And if I just went out for a day and picked a spot and went shooting around there, and I get home a couple days later, I go around, I go, when the hell did I take this shot? Like, what was I doing there? Right. I don't remember being there because most of the time I spent over there. But you got to kind of feel the scene.
Yeah.
And you have to wait for it to speak to you. And you got to warm up and things. And so you might take a couple of shots that are just you thinking you should do it. And then you go, nah, this isn't going to work. And then you move on to something else.
Yeah.
And the money was in bodies, right? I mean, he's the first photographer, I'm pretty sure, here, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
And I think Scott mentioned before, Frazanito mentions this too, that he's interested in getting pictures of bodies, and they're being buried. And this is already July 5th, because he doesn't take pictures of the seminary building and things like that. But my question for you, Scott, is, okay, so he's coming in, and he wants Confederate dead. He hasn't found them yet, but he's found these Union dead, and I don't know if he knows it or not yet, but this might be his last chance of getting pictures of Union dead.
Right.
And he takes these pictures, and then what? He comes to the Seminary Ridge and then straight down to the Rose area?
Well, again, we're speculating here, but it would appear that what he then does
but
is...
he took those first, according to your theory.
Right.
Yeah, he takes these...
I think he has to take those first. I think that if he's out there later in the day, those dead are buried.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they have to be first because... they send a lot of burial details out on July the 5th to get to their dead on the first day's battlefield. And so it's also possible that those burial details came out and worked their way from the Chambersburg Pike south. Mm-hmm. We don't know. But again, if they did do that, then that may have been the best grouping of Union dead that he could have found.
Mm-hmm.
It's also possible there were a lot of dead from the Iron Brigade in Hearp's Woods, but that wasn't as powerful a picture. So I think what he's interested in is he wants to get the most moving images. So he gets two really powerful. I mean, we could all agree today when you look at those, they're like, how many thousands of times have they been used? They're really powerful images.
Well, especially if you see these colorized versions of them. I'm looking at it right now. Look at this thing. I mean, you can see that guy's face, and his tongue is swollen. It's horrible.
It is horrible. Yeah, and they're really powerful images, and so you've got them. You got your images of the Union dead, and you want to get Confederate dead. And again, we have to think, if you're Gardner, it's July the 5th. It's 2 days after the battle has ended. Really, one day. The Confederates just left the day before. And so you have to talk to somebody because there's no book that you can read or a guide or something like that itself on the Emmitsburg Road. And you have to suspect that some of the soldiers who were on the burial detail probably told him, if you're looking for Confederate dead, there was a lot of fighting. You got to go into town, south of town. There's a lot of fighting down there, and you're going to probably find dead. So he has to probably talk to people along the way, but my guess is you go to the Chambersburg Pike, you ride the pike into town, you go into the center of town, you head down the Emmitsburg Road, and then eventually you end up down in the area of the wheat field and the Trossel Farm.
Those photographs that, like a Devil's Den photograph, that was the next day, I think, weren't they?
Yeah.
So that would make sense.
He could have camped on the battlefield and then just got right up and started photographing again. I think Frazanito, in his book, he felt that he arrived from the South, and that's why he started there.
Right.
He began to take his pictures there. And like I said, I mean, this is we don't know where Gardner went and when he went. This is pure speculation, but we do know that they buried the Union dead from July the 1st on July the 5th.
Right. I think Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine and Vincent's Brigade was out in the Peach Orchard area on July 5th. Correct me if I'm wrong.
They were. They were on the Emmitsburg Road, and then they sent burial details out.
Right. At the same time. Chamberlain, I think, writes about being able to smell the dead Zouaves that had been burned in the Sherfy farm and so forth.
Yeah, they were. They were actually, Vincent's Brigade was right in the area of the Sherfy farm.
So this makes sense to me that Gardner can't get up there because the 5th Corps is there.
Right.
So he takes this kind of end run, go to the west, and then work my way up north, if you don't know the geography, listener. And now we've come in, look at this. There's some Union dead that haven't been buried, according to, if you're right about this. What percent sure are you that this is the place that
I'm
Gardner's
98%
98% certain. Okay.
I mean, I don't think I could ever say I'm 100% until if you could find, and I think probably the likeliest place to find this is maybe in a newspaper. But if you could find someone on that burial detail who wrote a letter to the paper, and there is an officer out there. You see him on horseback in the one photograph that's looking to the south. There's clearly an officer there. I tried to find out who he might be. I can't find out who that might be. Might be an officer from 142nd Pennsylvania, because I know they went out to bury dead out there. But if you could find one of those men who mentioned a photographer came out, that you got it. Then you got it. But until you can get that, I don't think you can say, yes, I am positive this is the spot. But I think between the landscape and the evidence in the photograph, and, going back to Gary and Tim, and they were going through and they were criticizing. I mean, I watched their episode when they tried to dismantle the argument that I had made.
Right.
And I didn't feel that there was really any substance to what they didn't talk about the evidence in the photograph at all. They kept talking about the landscape. And they really focused a great deal on, there was a very large, I think it might have been an oak tree that was near the Carrie Sheed's house on the east side of Seminary Ridge.
Okay.
It obviously was a really big tree. And they felt that tree, the top of that tree, should have been visible in the photograph Gardner took that is looking to the northeast.
So visible back up by Sheed's Woods.
My argument is that area of the photograph is so murky you would never see it. And I don't know if that tree was tall enough that you would actually see it over Seminary Ridge.
And it could just be like slightly out of frame.
Yeah, it could be. Now, there's another fellow, and I just forgot his name. He has a blog, focuses a lot on the Overland campaign. I talk about him in the blog post that I did. He agreed with me that the photographs were taken all along McPherson's Ridge, but he thinks that they were taken farther to the north. And on his blog, he had a lot of analysis of this. He thinks that they're dead of the 151st Pennsylvania, the 24th Michigan, and those guys I mean, he could be right. I don't think he's right in that because of what I see in the photograph. This looks like the end of a line. This looks like the flank of the unit turn. I think it's 121st. But one of the things he did was really interesting in there is he magnified the image that's looking to the northeast a great deal. And you can see in the low ground where General Alfred Scales' brigade advanced to and then was pinned down by this murderous artillery fire that killed and wounded 500 men in the brigade. There are a whole bunch of graves there. They're like sticks in the ground. And you can see them in the photograph that he magnified. You can see that there's a whole bunch of burials along. It's like, I think there's a fence line in that image there.
There's like, it looks like a,
yeah.
Something.
Thanks.
There is in this one here. It's not blown up, but
it's on the other. It's on the other side. You can see there's a worm fence there on the other side of that worm fence. He blew that up.
Oh, I see what you're talking about.
And you can see they're like, it's like they took off like a picket fence. They took the pickets off of the picket fence.
Yep.
And whether they wrote the name, because we know the Confederate Army buried their dead on the first day's battlefield.
Yeah.
The Union Army did not bury the Confederate dead. The Confederates buried their dead from the first day's field. And I also think that explains why you don't see any Confederate dead. If this was on Sickles' line, there should be some Confederate dead in that image.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Oh,
if you John Cummings, I think that's his name, John Cummings.
If
you read the blog posts,
there's going to be a link in the description. You guys can link that.
Yeah. You can go to his website. It's really good, in-depth analysis that he has. And you can weigh his argument as to where he thinks it is. But I always found that part of the work that he did to be really good.
Yeah. Huh. So, okay. So let's get into you mentioned the evidence that's in the photographs. So what I'm gathering is what you're saying is that everything but the landscape in the photograph is what you primarily focus on, and then the landscape is secondary to that. So in other words, if I could figure out from uniforms or things like that who these troops might be, or position of the way the dead lay, or whatever it may be, if I can go, well, that might be, the 121st PA. Then you say, okay, well, now does the landscape match where they might have fallen? Is that basically? Yeah.
So you look at as I mentioned earlier, you look at this evidence. Okay, there's a couple of places on the battlefield that this image could have been taken. First day's battlefield, those guys were all behind Confederate lines, and part of the second day's battlefield, the dead are in no man's land. So, for example, I mentioned 120th New York, which was a regiment that fought near the Trossel Farm.
Mm-hmm.
The Confederate skirmish line on July the 3rd, after the fighting on July the 2nd, was on the forward slope of the Emmitsburg Road Ridge.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the Trossel Farm was no man's land. The wheat field was no man's land.
So no Yankees could go out and bury them or recover them.
Or you could do it at night. And a lot of men went out at nighttime. There's lots of accounts of soldiers going out and wandering around the field in Cadore Thicket, around the Trossel Farm, and places like that, looking for dead and wounded.
Okay.
And finding them, a lot of times, finding them. And sometimes running into Confederates out there. Because, of course, some of the Confederate soldiers are going to be wandering around, if they're allowed to, because there's going to be fairly strict discipline in trying to keep people together. But you're looking for loot. I mean, well, the soldiers on both sides are doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just looking for stuff that they could pick up off the field. So that's the only place that the photographs can be taken. So that's where you look. You look in those areas where the evidence says this photograph could have been taken on the first day's field. It could have been taken on Sickles' line. So you go out and you look in those areas. There's not really any reason to climb around Culp's Hill, right? Or to go to East Cavalry Battlefield. Those are not cavalrymen in that photograph.
Right.
That'd be all the cavalrymen killed almost, except in Custer's brigade.
Right.
So you have to. That's what I'm saying is that the landscape is very important. But if you're starting with the landscape, then you're going to waste a lot of time because the evidence in the photograph has to drive where you're going to look for those landscape views.
So then, and a lot of the landscape, maybe not a lot, but I mean, I'm sure a good deal of the landscape on the battlefield or in the park today has changed since 1863. So you might be finding something that looks like something today that maybe isn't, because what it was then isn't that way. Because look at this one here. Okay.
Right.
So now I agree. This does look exactly like what you're saying it is. Now this is the one that's looking northeast, where it's got the railroad cut and Chambersburg Pike and Seminary Ridge.
Right.
But also, if you stare at it long enough, couldn't it be down, like if you kind of just go where the Emmitsburg Road and Pumping Station Road intersect there and go on the western side of that intersection, like southwestern corner of that intersection, just kind of look out on the field and imagine the Longstreet Tower over here and then the wood line. And then just doesn't, but that field, wasn't there something in that field post-war built in that field, or a farm, or
there was where I think you're talking about, there was a Stuckey's out there.
No, on the other, that would be the northwest corner.
Okay.
Ish. You know what I'm saying? I'm saying southwest corner. Wasn't there somehow the land was worked or used? It wasn't just laying there, this big open field for all this time.
Right. Yeah, I think that particular image you're talking about, you can get a match on the landscape. But if I'm thinking about exactly where you're talking about, but the evidence in the photograph doesn't match that landscape. And the other thing about it is you could, this was the other problem I always had when I would be out on the second day's battlefield. I could match that somewhere. And if I turned around, I couldn't match another view.
Right.
But then I could find somewhere else I could match the other view, but when I turned around, I couldn't get that view.
Okay. And then also, now, these were glass plates, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. And so the way we're looking at it now is the way our eyes would see it, not the reverse image coming out of the...
Yes.
Okay. Because that's important, too, because it's showing you which way they're facing.
Right. And it is possible, like in that particular image that you're looking at there, that the Confederates may have moved those men a little bit. They're not going to move them very far, but they may have rolled some of them over or moved them around to get at them. To
rifle their pockets and stuff?
Yeah, because you can tell they've opened their jackets, they've gone through their pockets, they've looked to see if there's any valuables, and they've taken it off of them.
Now, the open jackets is interesting because a lot of times when you see pictures of dead soldiers, their jackets are always open. And I've heard, they were looking for their wound, to get a look at the wound, but their bellies are never exposed. Their shirts are still always tucked in, and you don't always see a blood stain. So is that more from people going through them trying to? It
could be. I think also with some of them, the bodies are bloated and they could
just
burst
pop the buttons.
Yeah, that's very possible.
That was my next question.
Yeah. Another thing I just remembered is one of the other reasons why I never considered the first day's battlefield is that I forget where I had seen this, but somebody had written or I'd read somewhere that the Confederates had taken the uniforms off of the Union dead on the first day's battlefield because they could use the cloth.
They recycle them.
Right? They recycle them. The problem with that was in looking at all the accounts that I possibly could that we had in the park library that are contemporary accounts. I never found anybody who wrote that. Now, some of the Iron Brigade dead, they had mentioned that they had taken jackets off of them or trousers and stuff like that. So that area, there had been some. But other than that, I didn't find any evidence that anybody's uniforms were taken off of them.
Well, and clearly that's not what happened here because these guys have their uniforms on.
Right.
What do the uniforms tell you? Can you tell by the jacket? Does that narrow down what regiment it might have been?
I mean, I can't tell enough in looking at those jackets. I mean, there's enough units in the Army that, I can't remember if these guys all have sack coats or some have frock coats on, but I mean, there were guys with sack coats and frock coats and a lot of different regiments in the Army.
Yeah.
Along those lines, I'm going to just quote something that Fresnito says about this. I just want to remind you all that the two pictures that Scott's talking about are the only two that Fresnito in his book says, I have not found where this camera angle was, which is really cool, I think. But, okay, so Fresnito says, of further interest in this scene is the article of clothing rumpled on the ground to the far right, and I'll pass the book over to you in a minute, Scott.
Yeah.
Next to the dead soldier with his arm over his head, clearly visible against the dark coloring is what appears to be the diamond-shaped badge worn exclusively by soldiers of the Union Third Corps.
Right.
I'm not convinced as I look at this. What do you think of that?
Well, the other thing is that since Fresnito did that book,
I see what you're doing.
You've been able to get super high resolution copies of these images, and under really high resolution, that is not a Third Corps badge. That is actually the top of a cap.
That makes sense.
Of a Union soldier's cap, like the underside of the cap,
the inside,
of a cappy, the inside of a cappy. Yes, and that also, like I said, I read Fresnito's book. I looked at that, and I'm like, that all makes sense. That has to be on the Third Corps line. These are Third Corps soldiers. and then it wasn't until you started getting a little bit better technology. That's why I say, I think if Fresnito, because he's a really smart guy, if he did this book today, he'd have found the location. He'd have figured out where it was.
He's got a different battlefield to work with now.
He does. And, the landscape work that they did at Gettysburg in the early 2000s, the mid 2000s, transformed this place. It really did.
I love it.
Yeah, it opened up views that we haven't had since the 19th century.
Yeah.
And it helped us to understand parts of the battle that were a little bit baffling.
Are there areas of the battlefield that you think they still should be restoring?
No, I think there's areas of the battlefield that we need to make sure we maintain.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the critical thing, because when we were working on the museum project, we had a scholars advisory board, and one of the scholars on the board was Jim McPherson. And one day we got talking about the landscape rehabilitation, and Jim McPherson said, he didn't really care about it, and I was like, What?
Could you not?
What do you mean? And he said, the National Park Service never follows through.
Oh.
They never follow through.
So he's looking 20 years in the future.
That's what he was doing. He was like, I think it's great you just did this. 20 years from now, you're just going to let it start growing up again. And I never forgot him saying that. And so when I retired from the Park Service, a big part of my message to everybody when I was leaving is, you have to have a plan to maintain this. And it's not sexy and it's not exciting, but it is what people want. Mm-hmm. We were cutting down the trees. I had all sorts of friends. I go in there, why? And they'd be like, what the hell are you cutting those trees down for? Yeah, nobody cares. And one of my friends told me one time, he says, nobody cares about that.
It's not true.
I said, after where's the restrooms, the most asked question that I got is this what it looked like in 1863? Mm-hmm. I said, that is what the visitor to this park expects us to do. Not just wants us to do, expects us to do.
Yeah.
And so that is a concern of mine. I want to make sure that, like the Kadori Trossel thicket, how do you maintain a thicket? That's not easy.
Right.
That takes work.
And aren't there areas on the battlefield even now where there are trees that are growing back up?
The field of picket's charge. There's a lot of cedars that are growing up in places that once they get really big, then it becomes hard to get rid of them.
Right.
So, there are definitely places that, and I sympathize with the park because it's easy to criticize the National Park Service, but they have been savaged in budgets since the early 2000s, really badly. There was about 100 full-time employees when I was there, 2014 when I retired. Now there's about 60-some.
Really?
They've lost about 30% of their employees and haven't replaced them, and still get a lot of work done. So And one of the things they've done that they're starting to employ that's been really effective is controlled burns. So they did a controlled burn on the south end of the battlefield. It was very effective. It got rid of a lot of exotics and other stuff. You have to have the right climate conditions and everything like that for those. But they are trying to make some efforts. My concern is just to make sure you actually have a system in place, that it doesn't matter who the superintendent is. Whoever's coming in, this is what we do.
Right.
This is part of our maintenance of this landscape. And until you get that, anytime a superintendent comes in, he could say, I'm going to focus on such and such. And the landscape just kind of, that's what happened.
Yeah.
That's what happened. Because in the 1920s and the 1930s, everybody was concerned about the Dust Bowl. So the emphasis on the Gettysburg battlefield and other places was soil preservation. That's what they were interested in. They didn't care about there weren't trees in this location. They didn't care because we're preserving the soil.
Right. Okay.
That wasn't as important to them. And so, you had all these woods that grew up, over 500 acres worth of woods that were non-historic. And by the time, somebody who's born in the 1940s or 50s, they're an adult. This is the landscape they've always known.
Right.
So you start cutting those trees down, they're like, what are you doing?
Yeah. And people love to say this is the way it's always been, so why change it? Yeah. But you know what, though? You mentioned the cedars before, and one thing that I think I wish there was a way that more people knew about it is the Adopt a Position program.
Yes.
Because, we adopted 3. We have the 59th New York, 69th PA. You did a tour of that last time. And the 111th New York.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, last April, we went and we did our first one. And, that area is so well visited that it's really not much cleaning up that we have to do because it's pretty well taken care of. But in April, there were a lot of little cedar saplings in the field in front of the 111th.
Oh, yeah, right.
And they said, if you could just go through here and clear them out.
Yeah.
And we're like, yeah, no problem. And then I looked over in the field a little bit north of the 111th, which really wasn't our responsibility. And I said, well, what about there? And then we spent like 2 hours pulling these damn things out, and my back was killing me. And everybody was cursing my name. But
first 2 hours of work Matt's done. And
well, I was supervising. My back was hurt. They were sympathy pains. But I mean, we removed, and to this day, not one damn cedar stands in that field because of us.
Good for you.
But what I'm saying is that, these are things that people can do. We do them twice a year. You guys can come out, listeners can come out and help us pull cedars out once a year at least. And but there's plenty of monuments that are on that list that don't have anybody that's taking care of them. And it's a great way to help keep the park pretty. You don't have to rely on the government to do it all because, like Scott's saying, they can't like they used to. And that was a worry of mine, too, when they started cutting the trees. I was like, this is awesome because I love it. I want to know what 1863 was like. When I come into the boundaries of the park, I don't want to know about whatever year it is.
Right. Yeah.
I want to know about 1863. And so, but my one worry was, will they maintain this? Because isn't the charter something to the effect of maintaining it so that a veteran can come back in 100 years and know exactly where he is? Is that part of it?
There's nothing written in stone. I mean,
I thought that was.
No, I mean, there was a general management plan that the park wrote that came out in 1999, I think, something like that. And general management plans are good for generally about 20 years, although they're so expensive. They last sometimes 40 years. But, if you do another general management plan, somebody could completely change the emphasis in that management plan.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'll be honest, there was always a little bit of friction within the NPS between the battlefield landscape and the commemorative landscape. And there was even an era in the park's history in the 1990s in which we attempted to manage the Gettysburg battlefield as a memorial landscape.
Okay.
So what we did in that management idea, which was not successful, was we managed the landscape to look like it did in the commemorative era. Now you ask me, what was the commemorative era? Well, that was a moving target, because I asked that question a number of times, and every time the answer I got, the years range changed.
Okay.
And the problem with trying to manage a battlefield to a commemorative era is that what era are you talking about? You're talking about the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, which didn't want any monuments initially. Right. They just wanted to leave everything like it was. Are you talking about the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association when the veterans take over and they want to put monuments on the field and they begin to put roads in? Or are you talking about the War Department? Because everybody is, what they're doing, there is no master plan for the Gettysburg battlefield. It's not like Central Park. You don't have Frederick Law Olmsted creating this master plan. Gettysburg was a evolving landscape, and it was evolving because there were pressures from visitors and there was pressures from veterans who were saying, I want to get here, I want to see this, I want to do that. And so you're responding to those things, those pressures, and the battlefield is always evolving and changing all the time. So there is no master plan. So that was one of the reasons why when we worked on this general management plan, it became important that we said we are going to manage the landscape to preserve the battlefield landscape of 1863 with the acknowledgement that laid upon that landscape is a commemorative one. And that commemorative landscape has to be preserved.
Right.
So you have to preserve the monuments, and
Sure.
if they put a little fence around the monument that was part of the design, you got to preserve those things.
But not if they put evergreens or something like that, shrubs around them.
Well, if it was approved as part of the design, I mean, even though there aren't any that I can think of that are like that.
But weren't there at one point?
There might have been some shrubs in some places, but sometimes that was the idea of somebody in the War Department.
Yeah,
For example,
it was after the fact.
The planning of shrubs and things inside the graves in the National Cemetery infuriated William Saunders because Saunders didn't want anything in there.
Yeah.
And he was furious that they put those plantings in there because somebody thought it would look nice. So anyway, you have to, I mean, there's some nuance here. You have to use some common sense in applying these things. But when you say, okay, we're going to go to the battlefield, we're going to preserve the landscape of 1863. So then you have a question, okay? People would say, well, what are you going to preserve it to? June 30th. Really? June 30th. So do you know what the Bliss Farm looked like? And the Harmon Barn and places that were destroyed during the battle. And the other problem is there's no entrenchments at that time period.
Right.
So as you go through, do you want to do June 30th, July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd, July 4th? The battlefield is changing every day of the battle because of the battle, right?
Yeah.
So that was when our superintendent at the time, John Latcher, who was a transformative guy in the history of Gettysburg. I mean, he did more than any superintendent ever did.
Controversial guy.
Controversial, but good guy to work for. I really like working for him. But he got more done than anybody ever who worked for the National Park Service, ever. And he was a colonel in the Army Reserve.
Oh, really?
So he had he fought in Vietnam and stuff. He had military training, and he said, why don't we... In the Army, we have this thing called COCOA.
I've heard of that.
Cover and concealment, avenues of approach, obstacles, observation, so on. So it's an acronym, right? And it's how you look at a landscape. He said, if we apply that to the Gettysburg landscape, then the features that we are going to rehabilitate, we never said restore deliberately, because restore means, okay, I'm going to restore it to some day.
Right.
Rehabilitate were the features that influence the fighting of the battle.
Okay.
So it can influence the operational movement of troops, but it also could influence the tactical movement of troops. You got to climb over a fence. That orchard might give you some cover. Then the open nature of the woods might make a difference as to how much cover you had or didn't have, and so on. And when we applied that to the battlefield landscape, it worked brilliantly
Yeah.
because you restored the landscape that was of an 1863 battle, but you didn't have to worry about these little tiny details like what did the Bliss Farm look like? And what were all the features around the Bliss Farm? Because we don't know. So you couldn't restore those. But a visitor to the battlefield today, they can see the avenues of approach. They can see the obstacles. They can get the observation that they had. They can find the cover and concealment that they had, and I forget the other one in the acronym. Yeah. But you can do all of those on the battlefield today.
Right.
So it, to me, worked really, really well, and at the same time, it preserved this commemorative landscape that was also on the battlefield landscape. And I think that it married those two in a really efficient way. But there always is some friction in there between those people. So, for example, the park did a big project in the north end of Cemetery Ridge where they reconfigured where the Cyclorama Building was. They put in trails and stuff, and everything they did there was, you can look at photographs from the commemorative era, and it is like that's the commemorative era on the north end of the battlefield. The way they built the stone walls, where they put the footpaths, they don't make any sense for the visitor today.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yep.
But they made sense if you are trying to create. So there was an example where, yes, you can have this management philosophy, but that if management changes and then other voices start to get involved in the whole thing, you can move away from the way you've been managing the field to then something else, the commemorative layer. Like, for example, we also put up the gates that were in the 1890s when you entered the park.
Oh, yeah.
They built these big elaborate gates when you would go into the park along Hancock Avenue, which is
right. Okay, yeah. Because
that's at the cemetery parking lot. So when they put them in, they restored them. They put them back where they were. People started trying to drive through there because they thought it was part of the road.
Right.
And because there was nothing put up to explain what they were.
You're talking about the new, what we call Hancock Gate.
Yes.
Right where...
Right.
Near where the old visitor center was.
Yeah,
That's
across
just a
from the
few years
cemetery.
old now.
Right.
But there was one during the Memorial period, whatever that is.
Right.
Right there? That
right.
looked like
Yes.
that. Okay.
Yes. But the thing was, in that era, the gate made perfect sense.
Right. Yeah.
It was, and it was also in keeping with that era and the sort of ornate things that they wanted, and they wanted this experience. Here is how you enter the park. You're driving into Hancock Avenue. You're going through here. Well, like, no one drives through it now. It's just sitting there. There's no interpretation about it.
Yeah.
It's
just kind of random looking.
Doesn't make any sense. So when you make management decisions like that, to me, they don't make sense.
Yeah, little
They're not
sense
consistent.
helps.
They're not consistent with. So I wouldn't have a problem if you said we're going to put these back in, and we're going to interpret them, what their significance is. But everything, and probably people are going to throw stones at me on this, but everything that the veterans did during the period that they were alive, the commemorative era, is not sacrosanct. Because it wasn't for them. It doesn't mean that you can willy-nilly go through and get rid of things. But there are some things, for example, they did this pipe rail fencing.
I was just going to
You can still find
They're
the pipe.
around.
I was hiking on the battlefield today with my dog on the horse trail off West Confederate Avenue. And when you're down near the Piper Farm, you're down near Pitzer Woods. You can see it down there in the woods. That is a feature of the commemorative era. In my argument, that is not a commemorative feature. That is a functional
boundary
marker that they put up that was cheap, expensive to build, cheap to maintain. It has no commemorative value. Restoring that has zero value to understanding the Battle of Gettysburg or its commemoration. So that's an example of something that I look at that, and also Emmer Cope, who was the engineer with the War Department when it became a national park. He had these to prevent carriages and stuff from cutting corners on roads. He had put these shell stones up. There was a really neat design feature. It was a really cool design feature.
Okay.
So it was a stone with a shell on the top of it, and it kind of was this really cool thing that integrated with the Civil War landscape and kept people from doing something you didn't want them to do. We don't have them on the field anymore. They took them all off of the field. And if they were still on the field, if I was working at the park, I would say, then you leave them on the field, right?
Uh-huh.
But I don't see any reason to put them back on the field because they served a functional purpose.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a commemorative purpose to them. So there's the kind of the line and it's not always clear. I mean, and you're always going to have some debates about this because there might be something that you're like, I don't think, and then somebody else is going to make a good argument why it is. But I think that original idea and that general management plan in the late 1990s of managing the battlefield landscape with a commemorative landscape laid on top of it is the most effective way to manage the battlefield. It's the most effective way, certainly, for the people who visit the battlefield,
right?
And what it is that they're interested in learning about this place.
I think that the old relics of the Park Service, or I guess really even back to the War Department, all these things that you find like, what the hell is this? Like it's not even like a full pipe. What'd you call it?
Pipe rail fence.
Pipe rail fence, yeah. It's not even like a full fence.
Yeah.
It's just like one section of it.
Yeah.
And it's like in some brush somewhere, and you come across it. And you're like, what the hell is this?
Yeah, where
or
the listener can find some. Coster Avenue, north of town.
Yeah.
There's a
Kilpatrick
little sliver
Avenue.
of national park land. The north boundary of that is that old pipe fence.
Right.
Or down by the by Rock Creek, if you're on East Confederate. There's a monument to the 28th Pennsylvania who were skirmishers down there by Rock Creek. There's still a section of it there too.
Yeah, which is probably good.
When
so you
I
don't
first
go
became a
running into the creek.
guide, early '90s, I think one of the big topics in the guide room was, oh my goodness, are they really going to? And it was restore or replace those fences, and as opposed to more the type of fence you would have found in the time of the battle.
The thing is, where those pipe rail fences are, there weren't fences there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
during the battle,
in a lot of places, there weren't any fences there at all. They just this was government land and that was private land, and that was their easy way of differentiating them. I've even had people. Sometimes I would have professors that would come in and bring their classes in, and they were very interested in the kind of the history of interpretation on the landscape.
Yeah.
And I remember one of them saying that, he wished that we would keep out on the field from all the different eras the wayside exhibits that we did.
How confusing would that be?
I said, then you'd have a junk pile.
Yeah.
All right. You'd have a junk pile on the field. I said, the thing is that a wayside exhibit that the National Park Service erects is not a commemorative exhibit. It's an informational exhibit. And there is a difference between the two.
Yeah.
You cannot compare that with the monument of the 147th New York. There's no comparison between the two. The one is trying to help you understand the 147th's role in the battle or whatever, but it's not a commemorative item. And so there's always going to be some people that get so deep into Gettysburg that they want to keep everything that has been there over time because it's what they remember, or they're interested in it, and they lose sight of the fact that you're like, listen, that's not what we're here for. We're here to help people understand what happened here and interpret the landscape, both the commemorative and the battlefield landscape and the Battle of Gettysburg. And that's what these exhibits do on the field, and they're going to change. We had the issue with the Cyclorama Building. And this is an issue, this is definitely an issue at Antietam with their visitor center. Once a building is over 50 years old, then it goes on the historic landmarks list, and it becomes really difficult to remove the building. And we had no end of lawsuits. I don't know how many lawsuits there were. Maybe it was just one lawsuit, but it was a really long drawn out battle over the Cyclorama Building because it was designed by Richard Neutra, who was a world-famous architect. Even though this was not one of his best buildings. I mean, within a year of the building being built, a lot of the design features in it failed. Because the building settled. The building settled, and when it settled, some of the design features he had stopped working the way they were supposed to. Like the
doors, is that one of them?
The doors, also the waterfall, it was supposed to come down.
Oh, waterfall?
Yeah, it would capture the water on the roof, and it came down into a little holding pond out front. Which we had the holding pond when I first started there, and everybody would flip money into it. but
because that was originally the National Park Service Visitor Center.
That was the visitor center,
and then the Rosenstiel building was a private business,
right?
And then the Park Service bought it.
Yes,
and the collection.
Because the Cyclorama Building, from the time it opened, couldn't handle the number of people that came.
It's very small.
It was designed really for maybe maximum visitation to the battlefield of about 300,000.
Okay.
So I talked to people who worked there at the time that it opened, and they told me, they said you'd have a ranger outside entertaining the masses who were waiting to get in. Then you would push another mob of people, because they used to take 200 up into the painting.
Okay.
You would put almost 200, 150, I think was the number that could, or 187, who could sit in the auditorium.
Summertime?
Yeah. So they would put all these people into the film, and then there would be people in the painting. The ranger in the painting would lead the people out of the painting out to the back patio, and then they would herd the people from the theater up to the painting, and then they would bring in the next mass. So that it was just too many people.
Yeah, that's too much.
And if you ever were in the restrooms in the Cyclorama Building, and you imagine 500,000 people coming in there.
No way.
Handicapped people, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
So they bought the Rosenstiel building, and then that became the Park Visitor Center, and then the Cyclorama Center was the Cyclorama
Center.
Center.
What year did they do that? When did the park headquarters move to Rosenstiel's building? Which for the listener,
72?
72, okay.
I think 10
was
years.
that big brick building right across from the National Cemetery.
Yeah.
So how long, when was the Cyclorama built?
62.
So 10 years?
10 years.
They were in there, and then they're like, I can't take it.
Yeah.
Look at that beauty up on the hill there.
Yeah, so you have essentially a visitor facility that was built in the wrong location, but its purpose was to help people understand the historical events that occurred on the battlefield outside of it. And then it grows a life of its own. This is the danger of these things sometimes.
Yeah.
And then you get a group of people who will rise up, and they're like, it has historical significance itself. Mm-hmm. It is as significant as the Battle of Gettysburg. And you're like, seriously? I mean, if there was not another Neutra building anywhere in the world, but there is,
right.
And if this was the best example of a Neutra building, you might make the argument that you have to preserve it. But ultimately, I mean, they were able to take the building down, but it gets to the point of the danger sometimes you have. You have to really carefully think through these things. Yeah. Of keeping in mind, what is our purpose here? What are we trying to do at the Gettysburg National Military Park? We are trying to preserve the site of a gigantic battle, which has a national cemetery. Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address there. We had a president who lived off the battlefield, Dwight Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. We have his farm. So you have certain things.
Cliff Arquette. Don't forget Cliff Arquette.
Of course. But you have,
Charlie Weaver.
But you have these things that they're the core. I mean, and there's always these forces that are pushing at, yes, I know there's enabling legislation, but, I mean, we should be interpreting this and that. And I'm like, once you start going down those holes, there's no end to where you can go.
Yeah.
So you get a superintendent who comes in who's really super interested in farming in the 19th century, and his emphasis is on farming. This is a really interesting place, the farms on the battlefield. He doesn't give a hoot about the Battle of Gettysburg, which is the only reason the park was created.
Right.
So
when Latcher started cutting the trees, I remember people complaining because they like to rollerblade through those woods or this, that, and the other thing. And all of their answers were not in line with what the point of this place is.
Right.
And they would annoy the hell out of me because I was like, well, I mean, I understand. It is beautiful.
Right.
I get that.
Yeah.
I totally do. But it's going to be beautiful without the freaking trees.
Well, the other point I made to people is that, look, we're cutting trees down. We're creating grasslands. And for one thing, the state of Pennsylvania has lost a vast amount of its grasslands. So at one point,
because we keep too much.
We did plant, in the last few years, they planted soybeans all over the field to pick its charge. But there was a moment there in like the mid-2000s, late 2000s, that the Gettysburg battlefield was the largest grassland in Pennsylvania.
Really?
I know that.
Then the soybeans had to come along.
I started seeing, different bird species that I'd never seen before on the battlefield, because it was conducive to. So the point I was making to people who were complaining, I'm like, look, we're not making parking lots here.
Right.
It's
right? So, yeah.
And I can take you to one clear cut or selective cut in Michaud State Forest, just one state forest in Pennsylvania, that they've cut more trees and more acres than we did in all of Gettysburg.
Right. And we have a lot more trees than they had back in the 19th century, at least in the populated areas.
Yes, I mean, like if you're in Gettysburg, there definitely is. But on the battlefield now, I mean, other than some of these places that trees are popping up and places that trees are always going to pop up, the landscape is pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean, the boundaries of the woods are pretty much the boundaries of the woods in 1863, and the fields patterns are pretty much 1863. That's why I say, I mean, it is, I think, the best preserved battlefield in the country.
And it's definitely the best marked
Civil War battlefield.
I want to just interject for a minute and bring this back to the photograph, and this might be it for the photograph, I don't know. But talking about the cultural landscape and the changes that have taken place over the years, in the photograph, the northeast view, there's that fence. Does that appear in the Cope map or some of the other maps that the early engineers did? Warren map?
I don't remember them showing a fence there.
Okay.
I don't remember that. The earliest map is the Warren map. That's there was a map done by Emmer Cope from horseback in 1863. The Army sent him up here, and that map it's very interesting, but he wasn't trying to create a definitive map of the battlefield. In 1867 into 1868, the Warren Survey comes to the battlefield, and they map it 1 inch to 200 feet. So that's super detailed map. The thing about that map is that they knew that there were fences in places that there were no longer fences, and there had been some changes since the battle, and there had been some things that had happened during the battle. And they did try to go around and talk to landowners about, was there a fence here that's not here anymore? And the landowners tried to impart that to them. But if you look at the Warren map and then you look at historical accounts, there are some places that they missed. So it is possible that there was a fence line that ran through there.
But it doesn't show up on the Warren map. It doesn't show up in the Warren map, yes. Yeah. That bothers me just a little bit. I don't know if that bothers you as far as...
Well, you're always looking for something like that because there's a landmark. You see this landmark in there, and then you go to the Warren map, and then you don't see a fence there. You're like, that's worrisome. But, for example, if you go up onto Oak Ridge, where Robinson's division, 1st Corps Division, was positioned, there's a sawed-off tower up there. And you look on the Warren map at the fence lines in the area where Iverson's brigade advanced. They don't look anything, or they're not anything like they were at the time of the battle. So in the history of the 97th New York, Isaac Hall wrote that. He was a veteran of the regiment, and he went to great lengths to try to determine, because he knew that what you saw there after the war wasn't what he had seen. And there were more fences out there in 1863. But after the battle, the armies had left, the landowner didn't put some of them back in. Because the other thing about these fences is that a lot of times, particularly on the first day's battlefield, the Confederates burned the fence rails for fires.
Yeah, that was my point.
So you couldn't recover your fence and rebuild it.
Right.
Is that the Forney farm, by the way, you're talking about?
That's the Forney farm. Okay. Yeah.
So there could have been a fence. Are you talking about a fence going like west to east? Like basically...
Be north to south.
If Scott's right about where the camera was placed, that would be a north to south fence.
Be north to south.
North to south.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's clearly in the photograph. That's
clearly.
That's the one thing.
Right.
Which photograph are we talking about?
This one.
The northeast view.
The northeast view. That one in the middle there.
Yep.
So you're saying that's running north to south.
That's essentially north to south.
So it would go. It would go like this, like off the frame in this direction here?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
But so...
I'm trying to imagine that fence surviving the assault of Pender's
That's what I was going to just say. Yeah, how could that have...
Well, you would be surprised, for example, at Burnside's Bridge.
At Antietam.
At Antietam, there is the road that led up to the bridge, which they called the Rohrback. They called it the Rohrback Bridge because the Rohrback farm was in that area, and it was the Rohrback Bridge Road. Up along it would be the east side of the road, there was a post and rail fence that was built along the east side of the road. And then there was adjacent to where you went onto the fence, there was a gate, and then there was another fence that ran down to the stone wall that ran north from the bridge. So there is a tremendous amount of fighting in that area.
Oh, yeah.
And the assaults
in fact,
on the bridge.
there's monuments right along there today.
Okay.
Right.
I can show you a photograph that's taken on September 19th, and that fence, the post and rail fence, not a rail's down on it that I can see. Not a rail.
Really?
And the 11th Connecticut fought right behind it, and they lost a lot of men. I mean, they were in really heavy fighting. Then you can look at where the 51st Pennsylvania was. When they left their cover and went onto the bridge, there was a gate in the fence, and they couldn't get the gate open. And there was this one guy in the regiment who'd been a bricklayer in Norristown who was really strong. And he ripped the gate off. And when you look at the photograph, you can see where the gate's been knocked down and where these guys went through. So there's an example of, we would imagine, in the heat of battle, these guys are going to trample all this stuff and knock it over and just flatten it down, or even after the battle. But they didn't.
Except they didn't at Pickett's Charge.
There's a natural funneling to the Rohrbach Bridge.
There is, but the thing is that these guys in the 11th Connecticut fought behind the fence.
Understood, but I might want to keep as much of that fence as I can, if for nothing else, just to study my aim.
But you would think that in the course of fighting that they would knock these. But here's another. When Willard's brigade marches from the north end of Cemetery Ridge down to near where the Pennsylvania Monument is today, they write about the fences that they had to go through. So you would think, once again, they would flatten all these fences. They didn't flatten all the fences because if it wasn't in your way, you didn't spend the energy to deal with it. You just left it up. So,
and those post and rail fences you couldn't just push them over.
What kind of, can we tell what
that
kind of
looks
fence
like a
that
worm
is?
fence to me.
It does.
In that photo, it definitely looks like a worm fence.
I'm just trying to picture what's going on if you're right about where the camera was. What's going on all day on July 1st? I know that the Iron Brigade is going to be having barricades built on the seminary grounds.
Right.
Where are they getting some of the wood for that? And look at right out there. There's that fence.
Well, that barricade was built from the fencing around the woodlot at the seminary.
Okay,
and that was built by men of Robinson's division.
Okay, then that answers.
But
that.
if you look at this photograph, and then when you blow the thing up, that fence is almost completely demolished.
Yeah,
and there's not even. It's clear that some of the rails are gone.
Okay.
I mean, they've taken some of the rails away, either for firewood or maybe they corduroyed a road with it. We don't know. I mean, they might have done some of that with some of the wood that's laying out there, because if it's a worm fence, those were the easy ones to tear down.
Right.
And also when Perrin's attack and Scales' attack go through those areas, the men may have knocked down those fences, but not completely, because you can see that one corner, it looks like, in the photograph that's still standing.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. It's just one intersection that's still there.
But I definitely noticed that, Bob. And, it's something that if I kept digging into this thing, Where I would probably go is I would probably look at accounts from men in Perrin's brigade and Scales' brigade, contemporary accounts, and see if any one of them mentions a fence that they had to cross. Now, I think that the colonel of the 14th South Carolina, Brown, mentions a fence that they had to cross about 200 yards from the seminary. I don't quote me on it, be certain, but I thought that he did mention that. That doesn't show up on the Warren map.
Okay.
As I remember. So anyway, but to get to your point, I mean, it's a good point, because those are the sorts of things you're like, well, okay, you've got to research them. You've got to try and exhaust all the sources that are out there. And particularly if you can find contemporary accounts, or if you can find, in the case of like the colonel of the 14th South Carolina, did he ever write Batchelder? Because a lot of times when they're writing Batchelder, they're gonna write about features on the landscape, because he might be interested in that.
Why don't you just explain for the listener what the significance that is of writing Batchelder?
John Batchelder was a historian, artist, an amateur historian, and he had been accompanying the Army of the Potomac in the Peninsula Campaign during the 7 Days battles in that period, and because he thought the big decisive battle of the war was going to occur in the summer of '62. And of course it doesn't. McClellan gets defeated down in the 7 Days battles. Batchelder, like a lot of Union soldiers, got sick, and he went home to New Hampshire, which is where he was from, to recover. And he also dabbled in photography, interestingly enough. So he was kind of in touch with both sides of his brain. But he also had this strong interest in writing history of a really important decisive battle. And he wanted to do that for a battle in the Civil War. He'd wanted to do it for the Battle of Bunker Hill, but he found that it was very poorly documented, and he couldn't do it. So that kind of taught him, we got to document this well. So he had contacts in the Army, and he told his contacts in the Army, look, if you see something that you think is going to be really big, really important, I want to know about it. And obviously he either read it in the papers or someone told him about Gettysburg, and he came down here, arrived on July the 5th. He spent 78 days on the battlefield, sketching the battlefield, interviewing wounded Union and Confederate soldiers. He would take them out on the battlefield with him. And then he went down to Brandy Station in the late fall, when the Army of the Potomac went into winter quarters after the Mine Run campaign. And he interviewed officers from every regiment and battery that had been in the battle.
Okay. For the listener, Brandy Station is one of the opening moves in the Gettysburg campaign.
You're right.
So he's expanding his focus more than just the 3 days of July.
Well, that's where the Army was in winter quarters, was
right.
around Brandy
Gotcha.
Station. So he went down there and he interviews men from every regiment and every battery. Of course, the 11th and 12th Corps had been transferred to the Western Theater, so he doesn't get those guys. He takes all these notes, goes back to New Hampshire, and he creates this isometric map, meaning it's like a bird's eye view of the Gettysburg battlefield. And make a long story short, it is just, everybody who sees it is astounded by it. George Meade endorses it. All of his corps commanders endorse it. Everybody who sees it is amazed by this map. And it sets Batchelder on essentially a lifelong mission to document the Gettysburg battlefield, and then ultimately to make Gettysburg a destination. So he, again, I'm making a long story short, but what he does is, starting in the 1860s, he begins to try to convene these meetings of veterans on the battlefield to mark positions where they had been on the battle. He makes some contacts with Confederates. He has a little bit of difficulty initially, but eventually a lot of Confederates are gonna work with him, because they see him as somebody who's objective and fair and interested in trying to get at the truth. So he's meeting with all these veterans on the battlefield. He gets a contract from the government to prepare 3 maps of the Gettysburg battlefield, one for each day. So he does that. Then he gets a contract to do maps of the cavalry battle. He does the cavalry battle, kind of an hour-by-hour sort of mapping of the cavalry battlefield. And meanwhile, he's also writing this history of the battle. And if you read the Batchelder papers, which is all these hundreds of letters that are written to Batchelder by veterans, because he corresponded with all these veterans, he's trying to establish positions of where troops were during the battle, because he's trying to create his maps. He's also trying to write the history of the battle. And then he has a third hat that he wears. He becomes the superintendent of monuments, tablets, and legends on the Gettysburg battlefield for this group called the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. So essentially, if you are the veterans of the 147th New York, for example, and you want to erect your monument on the battlefield, you got to run by the materials you're going to use, the inscription that's going to be on it, where you want it to be. All of those things go by Batchelder, and or someone he designates, because he doesn't do all of them.
Right.
And he's going to either approve or disapprove your legend, the materials that you use, because they don't want something that's going to erode and fall apart, like the 55th Ohio, which was made of sandstone.
Is that the one at the Peach Orchard?
No, that's at the northern end of the National Cemetery. They forbid people from using that material. But anyway, so Batchelder's doing all these things. Then he writes this history, which is this gigantic tomb that was essentially worthless, because he had all these letters, hundreds and hundreds of letters from all these guys. And he'd taken all these veterans on tours. He knew the battle. He knew the battle better than anybody alive. And lots of veterans wrote letters to that effect that he did. But I think what happened was, when you write a history, you have to interpret. And when you're going to interpret, you have to make some calls, some judgment calls. And there's going to be some people who aren't going to be happy with your interpretation. His work's not done yet. When he's finishing this history, he is envisioning, we need to create a national park that includes the Confederate side of the battlefield, because all they've got is where the Union Army was. Because the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, their charter is to preserve the site of the Union victory. So they actually had the power of condemnation within the lands that they owned, but they couldn't do anything on the Confederate side of the field. And so Batchelder began to petition powerful people that he knew to get legislation to make this a national park. Because he felt that was the way that they would be able to mark the Confederate lines. And he also corresponded with tons of Union veterans about how they felt about that. And that's in the Batchelder papers. A really fascinating reading to see what the Union veterans had to say about marking the Confederate lines.
Were they mostly for it or against it?
They were mostly for it, but they were very strict about what it was to say. They were like nothing about their cause. You can tell what they did in the battle and so on, but so they didn't have a problem with him marking the lines. But anyway, so he writes this history. The history is basically not of any real value, because all he did was he took all the official records and he just strung them all together, basically.
Oh,
and
God.
By, in a narrative form, and didn't put anything in that he had learned about this battle that might be interpretive. And I think the reason he did this wasn't because he was a bad historian and didn't know how to write this. I think he did know how to write it. I think he felt, if I do that, I'm going to burn all these bridges and I might never, ever complete the work that I think needs to be done here. So I'm going to take the safe course and I'm going to produce this thing that's going to make everybody unhappy. But they can't accuse me, because this is their own words.
Right.
So he is, I would say, when you look at the Gettysburg battlefield today, you visit Gettysburg today, Batchelder is the most important person in the history of the park.
Yeah, sounds it.
Because he not only made all of these great strides in marking the battlefield and in preserving the battlefield, but he also made it a destination. He published these souvenir guides, and he encouraged tourism to Gettysburg, which led to...
And how long after the war are we talking with that? 70s?
Well, they built the Springs Hotel, I think, in 1869.
Yeah, right.
So we're talking 1860s even.
So the 70s aren't even on us yet. The war's barely over, and already there's tourism.
And he's already trying to push tourism to the battlefield, and he always tried to push tourism to the field.
So, like, Batchelder is kind of the father of Gettysburg.
He is, and he's nowhere to be found.
That's amazing.
It is. It is.
I mean, really, we wouldn't have any of this stuff if it weren't for him. I mean, he's going and getting a history of this stuff before the war is even over.
Yeah, and the other thing about him was, if Batchelder would go to Washington, D.C., he would go meet with the Secretary of War.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't go to some low level. Right. I mean, he went right to the Secretary of War, and he would work with the Secretary of War on this thing. So he dealt at a very high level, and he was unafraid to, and he ticked some people off. And I mean, he was a controversial guy, and he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes.
Well, nobody's perfect.
But he was really passionate about preserving the Gettysburg battlefield and making it a place that was this unique site in American history. And I think he succeeded in that. I mean, there's a lot of other people, obviously, who are involved who helped make the park what it is today. But he's the catalyst, really, for everything that comes afterwards, that what we are today. He's really the catalyst for all of that.
Yeah.
Because you can read the Batchelder papers, you go through them, and you read these letters that he's writing to these veterans, and the way he's lobbying people to try to create a national park here. And Sickles gets the credit for it because Dan Sickles was a congressman. He introduces the legislation, and of course that's important. You got to know how to get the legislation through Congress and get that approved. But the impetus to get the legislation there
was Batchelder.
The origin really is coming from Batchelder.
Was Batchelder the one who pushed back against the 72nd Pennsylvania as to the placement of their monument?
Oh boy,
that's another whole can of worms.
That's a whole can of worms. We can do a whole show. He was furious about that monument.
Okay, so that was
furious about
that wasn't just some person he had delegated that to. Okay,
yeah.
It's another day.
There's like 30 shows that we could. Now, with other battlefields, though, did any of the other ones have a Batchelder, or is it because it's accessible?
Antietam did. Antietam had Ezra Carman.
So the two, and he started during the war.
Well, Carman doesn't really start his work at Antietam till I believe the 1890s.
Okay, so Batchelder is the only guy who's doing this stuff right after a battle.
And the other thing about Batchelder that's different is Ezra Carman, he's working for the government. He is trying to document where people were so he can mark this battlefield. Batchelder wants to mark the battlefield. He wants to make it a tourist destination. He's lobbying Congress to create this, ultimately to create a national park at Gettysburg. So he's wearing a lot of hats, and he's doing a lot of different things. He's like the ultimate marketing guy for Gettysburg. Whereas someone like Carman, I would say Carman is Batchelder's equivalent and perhaps his superior as a historian. But Batchelder is clearly in his own league as far as what he made Gettysburg into.
Yeah, right.
Now, they did a lot at Vicksburg, and they did a lot at Shiloh and Chickamauga and some of these other places. But in fact, Carman was involved in Chickamauga as well, even though he didn't fight there. But Batchelder is pretty unique. He's a pretty unique guy in the era that he lives, because he writes a great thing. He writes this when he went down to visit the Army of the Potomac, and he explained to General Meade what he was going to try. He was going to do this isometric map. Meade thought he was a nut. And he writes this thing. He says, when I told people what I was going to do, they thought I was a crank.
Really?
And that.
That's the same reaction I get when I go up to professionals like Scott and say, I want you to come on my podcast. And then you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah, I understand that. I sympathize with him.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk for 16 hours. Yeah.
Let me get a couple things in here.
Couple? All right, go ahead, Bob.
I think it might be where you're going anyway. Okay.
I was going to end it.
Right. So before you end it, let me just do this for our listeners.
I was going
to eat. You might want to edit this and put it at the beginning.
Just go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So we've been talking about this blog. How can a listener access that?
Okay.
And, go ahead and answer that.
The blog we started while I was working there at the park, and it's called From the Fields of Gettysburg. And if you go to the Gettysburg National Military Park website, you'll find a link to it. But you can also just do a Google search for From the Fields of Gettysburg or Gettysburg National Military Park blog, and that'll get you to the page. And there's a lot of great content on that.
Yeah. I'm going to put the links to this is a 3-parter that you did.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put the links to that in the description of this show. So you just need to click on those for that. What was the next thing you needed?
The other thing is, so when you do read it, and it's great, read it, we're on the battlefield. So if you have the auto tour route, I'm trying to take you out to where Scott believes the camera was. You're basically following the auto tour out towards stop 1. But before you get to stop 1, you've turned off of Route 116 or the Fairfield or the Hagerstown Road onto what is called Reynolds, and then take it from there.
And you're driving north on Reynolds Avenue, and you're going to see some monuments coming up on the right-hand side of the road. And
the first one you'll see is the 121st Pennsylvania.
And they are the end of the line for Colonel Chapman Biddle's brigade, which was the end of the line for the Union First Army Corps in defending McPherson's Ridge on July the 1st. So that's, you're getting close to where the photos were taken. It seems to me that the photos are taken kind of at the junction of where the 20th New York State Militia, which was on the right of the 121st Pennsylvania.
And there's flank markers showing that.
Yes, there's flank markers showing that, and you can go out and wander. There's also...
the 20th or the 80th?
Well, the 80th New York was their line designation.
Oh, okay.
And they were a militia regiment.
Okay.
And they never liked to be called the 80th New York. They always called themselves the 20th New York State Militia, even though that was their line designation, 80th.
So
same unit.
14th Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Same unit.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So so what does the monument say? 20th or 80th?
It says 20th New York State Militia.
20th,
But I also think it also has 80th on there in case anybody is curious.
Okay. All right, I'm sorry. I interrupted you.
No, that was it.
So about where the flank markers are, marking the
you get in
left
that
of
area, and then you can get out and walk out with the photographs.
Just maybe a little bit east.
Yeah.
Now, I bike this often on my bicycle tours, and I'll tell you, when I'm looking at that picture, that sure looks like you're right. Because just the slope of the land there as I'm looking off to the northeast. So I'm going to take the pictures out next time, and I'm going to say, well, what do you guys think? Is this where this picture was taken?
Are those in the, was it Library of Congress, or where do they have the high resolution scans online?
Library of Congress.
It's Library of Congress. Are those available there?
Yeah,
they are.
I believe these are on there.
They're from that. Okay. Yeah, we should go there and get those high res scans and print them out.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of images on there that when you look at them in high res, boy, it opens up.
It's amazing.
Different world. I mean, there's a licensed guide named Bobby Hoosh, and he did he had that Gettysburg Daily, which was kind of a blog that he did. And one of the ones he did was fantastic. There was this photograph that Gardner took of a dead mule or horse with a damaged limber. It was from a 12-pound gun, a Napoleon, they called it, and there was some other debris around it. And he put a name on it, and nobody ever really knew where that photograph was taken either. So, because it really was not clear, because all the landscape around it was very...
From here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was very unclear. And what Hoosh did is they downloaded the image, and then using modern software, they were able to get rid of the stuff that was obscuring what you could see. And if you look at the Gettysburg Daily and find these images, you can now see the Emmitsburg Road. You can see the 5th Corps trains, like an artillery battery, up there along the road. And it's clear where it is. It's near the Rogers Farm, near the Trossel Farm and the Rogers Farm on the second day's battlefield. I mean, and there was people, when he did that, they came out and they said, no, he's wrong. He's completely wrong. I was like, he's absolutely right. I mean, there's no question in my mind at all.
History teacher,
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things in the picture here that's facing south is the background is very hazy, I guess, from the rain and everything like that. But with Photoshop today, you could clear that up with just a little slider.
In fact, I think Cummings, that guy John Cummings, who I mentioned on his blog, I think he did that in on one of his blog posts about this. That's why it's worth. There's a link. I think I put a link on it in one of the articles that I did to Cummings' blog. So if you go to the blog that I wrote, you'll find Cummings' blog from there, and then you can look at his. And I think he did enhance some of those images so you could see the landscape a little better.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to. I can't find the link right now. But anyway.
One more thing.
Oh boy.
The blog is entitled "A Mystery Solved."
Bob, you beat me to the punch and everything here.
Sorry, Matt. How about you take over, Matt?
I was just gonna end it.
Okay.
I was gonna say though, a mystery solved.
It's the question mark.
There's a question mark.
That's right.
So right there, you're not saying this is. I am absolutely right.
No,
You're asking.
I'm pretty confident, but I'm not saying this is slam dunk.
That's right.
Right.
Earlier you said 98%.
I am. I'm at 98%.
Well, yeah,
but there's
that's-
that 2%.
Right.
That's not absolute.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think you lay out a pretty good case there, and everybody's going to just have to go and judge for themselves. Don't forget, click the links in the description there. Scott, thanks for always coming in. I love when you come in. And yeah, thank you all for listening. Have a good one.
Thanks,
All
Scott.
right. See you now.
Awesome.
That was a
Listen to you all day there.
6-hour interview.